So thank all of you for making time. This fantastic, great turnout already, especially considering that we're going to be doing a couple of these. So only half the group, so fantastic. So we won't go through everybody on here without take the whole meeting, but just so everyone knows who's on, we have here most of our working group or our project team for the transplant first work, and then we've opened this up basically to all kidney clinic and all transplant staff as we go through this. And we'll talk about the objectives in a second, but really this is meant to be an overview of all the work that's done so far and an opportunity for everybody to give feedback. So thank you for doing this. And maybe I'll mention here, if you want to give feedback at any time, you can either put up your hand. There's a way to do that through the little reaction thing there where you can raise your hand, or you can just speak up if need be, or type something in the chat. We'll kind of monitor all of those for any comments. We do appreciate comments there. So this is what we have on the line. We have all of our group, and then I specifically want to mention we've got Bill Deere, one of our patient partners, who's joining us as well here. Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Thank you.
So this is really what we're trying to accomplish here. One is going to be a brief overview, just in case some people haven't been completely up to speed with all the transplant first work, but that part I think most people are aware of. What we're going to spend the bulk of the meeting on is going through the work that we've done to date, and really what we is looking at all of our existing workflows, identifying where the gaps or kind of pain points, as we call them, are. And now we've come up with what we think are going to be the proposed solutions. We've done this through we have several large working groups here. We've kind of vetted that around, but the goal of today was to bring it to the wider audience as kind of the speak now or forever hold your peace type of a meeting. In other words, we want to make sure everybody's going to have a chance to see this. Who's going to be thought of. So we definitely want to hear from you. Go ahead. Where we are now, and it's been a long time high, for 5 years now. To think about this, and I like that the timeline goes back all the way to 2015 when we started looking at the pre-transplant activities, because really that was the recognition of just how much work happens before somebody ever even makes it to the door to get transplanted. So there's a recognition of that, and then as the years went on, we worked on this.
Mike, you're cutting out a little bit.
I think everybody else should mute their phone. I'm not sure who Maxim is, but it sounds like they're on.
Thanks, Nick. Perfect. Yeah, everyone can mute. Yeah. I'd like feedback, but not feedback as a noise coming through, feedback as in comments on our workflow. So that'd be great. So yeah, the first phase of our work here was really around that culture shift of having everyone appreciate that this is the preferred treatment method for people who it's applicable to. And that took some time. There was a lot of education, staff workshops, all kinds of things. And that kind of set the stage to then move on to this next phase. So whereas the first phase was really getting this recognition of the importance of transplant and getting all of our teams involved with it, now we're getting into the second phase, which is really the nitty-gritty of operationalizing this and making it happen. And so this is the goal. It's kind of wordy, but I do think it's worth mentioning that, really what our goal is to make sure that we've identified anybody who might possibly be a potential candidate, identify them, make sure people are assessed and supported on their way towards finding a living donor. Now, the scope here is really around living donor and specifically preemptive transplantation. But I think it'll be pretty obvious as we go along that a lot of the themes here will ultimately apply to all of our patients being worked up for transplant. Just the scope of the current work is within that box. Great. And you can see we've broken down into a few specific objectives. So first we had to figure out what are the workflows. We knew there was variability and gaps out there, but we really had to systematically take stock of that to identify what those gaps were. Once we did that, then we were able to get to the part about developing kind of new streamlined and standardized processes. Both of those words are very important. We want to both make it more efficient and more standard across the province so that everybody's having the same access to care. The third one, I think, is really one of the biggest points here is to work on communication. As you'll see, as we go through these workflows, that's such a big item. We call it out many times to enhance the communications in all directions, right? Between the kidney clinics and the pre-transplant teams and vice versa, between us as care providers and our patients, between us as care providers and any other care providers our patients interact with. There's a lot of communication streams that we need to think about. And so that's a big part here. And then, of course, we have, as we do for all things, an evaluation plan, a way of kind of refining this, knowing that this is going to take time going on. And the last one is around items to promise. We'll come to that as we start talking about some of these solutions here. So these pictures, I like these arrows. Sharon's sometimes self-conscious about the colors, but I like it. We're probably going to, make this look prettier, but you can see it's similar to what we've done with things like our transition guides and stuff like that, trying to put it into a visual format. And this is the way we represent the pre-transplant workflow. We have on here the future workflow, but it's becoming now the workflow, the current workflow. And you can see we have these bars, and it's really meant to span the whole totality of this process, right from us thinking about identifying patients all the way to them ultimately getting worked up and going on to having their transplant. You can see that we've got two bars that span the whole process because they're just so important. So the communicate, which shows up in both of this, the candidate and the donor workflows, again, calling that out specifically to say this is not a one-time item, but to make sure that these communication channels are always open and that we're being effective with this. And then when we go to the recipient, we talk about identify and educate. And again, we put this as a bar that spans the whole process, which I think is an important thing. It used to be when we've reviewed our workflows, that this was almost a one-time item to say someone got transplant education, but it's clear that this is something that needs to happen iteratively and at multiple points throughout the process, which is why it's laid out this way. Then the arrows as they progress. Oh, sure, yeah, let's go to it. I think that's fine. And then we have the donor one. You'll see the one other item I'm going to mention about these arrows. The other reason they're kind of split up like this is it also happens to follow where a lot of the bulk of the work is happening. So first, people are getting identified in the kidney clinic. A lot of this next step, the screen and test part, a lot of that happens in regional pre-transplant centers. And then the triage and assess is happening in the provincial transplant centers. And so it also we start to break it into buckets, as you can see, of where the work is actually happening. Great. So now we're going to start going into a little bit more detail about what we've identified under each of these buckets. So what we have here are summary slides, but there's a whole lot that went into this. We're kind of pulling out for all of you the big ticket items, either the big gaps we've noticed or the big changes we're proposing. So the first one, and it sounds kind of self-explanatory, but it is a big item of work, is to say that we want to make sure that everybody whose GFR is 25 and declining, meaning not just a one-off, but is truly on a declining trajectory, has been comprehensively screened to see if they're a candidate to move forward with the process. And so we're kind of flipping on the head what used to be before, right? In the current workflow, what we're seeing is that in a lot of places, essentially, we're kind of waiting for a nephrologist to say, okay, go ahead and start thinking about transplant. Whereas we're flipping that on its head to say that we need a way to have our teams constantly working a list to identify as people move into this box that we need to get the process going. This is very similar to other things we do in the kidney clinic, like making sure we're running our GFR list to see that people have a dialysis modality picked, that their access is moving forward. We're now bringing this into the same camp, where we're going to make sure over and over again that our teams are running that list to make sure every single person's been identified, rather than waiting for a nephrologist to give an order to go ahead. And then when we say that the process is underway, we'll come to this a few more times about everybody being able to see the process. I think we come to that later too, right, Sharon? I'll focus on that later on, yeah. So that's one of the biggest changes. It sounds like a small thing, but this is one of our big objectives, make sure we've identified everybody. And then to make sure people are moving through this process, we've broken this down into this group of milestones. So this is when we get to the nitty-gritty of the workflow items to make sure that somebody's moving ahead. And why we've called these ones out is, and I'm not going to read through them all, people can see them here, but why we've called them out is they're both important items along the process towards getting transplanted, and also items that we're able to flag and ultimately see and monitor and promise. Because if we're going to have people moving, able to see how patients are moving through and see what's still outstanding, they need to be items that we're actually capturing. So the things on this list actually meet both of those criteria. And I think we go through in each one, right, Sharon? So I don't need to go through all of them? Yeah, okay, perfect. See, there you go. You can tell this is real. We're going to be recording it, including me asking questions about the slides. So nothing edited here, no Hollywood magic. So the first step, this is happening in the KCCs. This is us identifying candidates and then moving them along to education. So as we've already talked about, the first step is comprehensively identifying that we've captured everybody who's progressing. And then we have a list of basically criteria to say, is this patient a candidate for education? Now, this is something that's already existed to an extent where basically what we would do is here's a list of absolute contraindications. And we would look at that before deciding to somebody get transplant education. But what we've done is we've done a couple of things here. One is we've updated those criteria to basically distill it down and make it as clear as possible. Some of the criteria before were a little bit vague. So we've made a shorter list and I think a more concrete list. And then what we've done is, you see that we have on here different colors. We have green, red, and yellow. And so what we've come up with is categories where basically the red is people who have those absolute contraindications. And so we're not going to even talk about transplant. We're glad that we screened them to identify this, and we'll document that so that we know that this is the case. The green is the so-called kind of slam dunks, right? People who are young and otherwise healthy and don't really have any other contraindications, where we are essentially automating the process and say, just move them along and get them educated. We don't need to wait, for an order. This can be a team-initiated order to move them ahead and get them educated. And then that yellow group, and we've kind of defined what all these look like, are people you might need to ask the nephrologist, should we or should we not educate this person? So already for those two bars on either extreme, we've automated the process to get them moving forward, and we've streamlined the questions we're asking. And then the next step that's starting in the KCCs is the education. And one of the items that's come up clearly, both from us and from our patient partners as well, is the need to separate out our transplant specific education, kind of separate it from the modality education, and to be checking in on an ongoing basis. Again, this whole point of it's not a one-time event, but rather something that happens iteratively. That does, I know it's going to come up as a question, that does mean a little bit of extra work, because instead people were combining sessions, we're separating them. But there also has been an adjustment to the funding model to account for that work of having to do a separate transplant specific education session. So it's going to be a key change in the kidney clinics. Okay. And then we have some items about supporting ongoing education. Oh, great, and I've already went to some of these. I was going to pause there, but okay. Right, so we kind of went into this a little bit. Now, like I said, some of it's going to be streamlined and team initiated. The one other data entry item is we've really tried to cut down on the number of screens people have to go into and the number of boxes and clicks that need to be done to get somebody to be a candidate. One of the big ones is before we were filling out the whole comorbid list in Promise, and that was an absolute necessity before doing it, before submitting the transplant referral. And we've since learned that the transplant teams don't really use that, rather they go to the nephrologist dictations. And so for this reason, we're cutting out some of that duplicate data entry, and then we're saying, for example, on that place we rely on the dictation. In Promise, there was a lot of places where people were essentially duplicating data entry. And so we're cutting all of that out, so that basically it only ever goes in one place, and then as much as possible, everything gets pre-populated to everywhere else it might have to go. And we've cut the number of different screens that people are going to go to, or we're going to. This is the work that's ongoing with Promise. We're going to. So rather than having to go to several different modules, there's only one data entry screen when it comes to transplant items. This is what we were referring to with this green, yellow, and red. Now, it might look a bit long, but that red list is basically the same as it's always been, the absolute contraindications, except we've made an effort to define it a little bit more clearly for some of them. And then you can see that the green bar is basically if they don't have any of those things in a yellow box, meaning that they don't have a lot of comorbidities, they're under 70, you just go ahead and start talking to them about this. Remember, this is about education, not them actually moving down the process, but hearing about transplant. And then the people who fall in that yellow box, you would get a clarification with the nephrologist. One other question I should probably preempt is we recognize that as we do this, the more we automate, there might be some people who go through education who ultimately are not transplant candidates, and that's okay. We've talked with our patient partners, we've talked with everybody, and the mindset there is, well, that's part of the process anyways, that at least those people would know that someone's talked to them about it. And even if the answer ultimately is no, you're not a candidate, at least we're not seen as hiding something or not giving people a chance to hear about transplant. So I think it actually, although we're going to end up educating people we ultimately say no to, I think ultimately it'll help us with those conversations when we do have the unfortunate situation where we have to say no, because at least the patient knows that we've thought about it. Great. And then the next item, as we talk about the education, as I said, is we're going to separate this out from the dialysis education. The feedback we've had from all our patient partners unanimously is that it's way too much to try to do it at once, and there's just too much to retain. And so we definitely need to separate it out and kind of have it going on an iterative fashion over time. We're still kind of finalizing what this looks like to provide this ongoing support for donor outreach. We know this is one of the trickiest areas, but basically how we coach someone along that process. We kind of have some thoughts of what this looks like, but the exact workflows are still being cemented. But that's what the concept is going to be, is rather than a just one-time education and say, okay, now go off and find your donor, a way to really empower our staff to be coaching patients through how they get to the next step of this process. Okay, so that's the bulk of the first step and the big changes that we've made. Most of this happening in the KCC side, that first process of identifying and getting people started through the screening to be considered for transplant. Were there any comments or questions? I'm going to keep them on the chat, but. Great. I'd say, Janice has her hand up.
Hi, I was just wondering, did we on our other KCC documents have GFR of 20 as our time to think about renal replacement therapy options? And are we going to have to revise that if we think 25 is a better number?
We're actually kind of specifically saying that to start thinking about this at 25 and declining, mainly as a prompt so that it happens before they do their other modality education. Now, we say that it must be done by the time they hit 24, or we're going to count that as an indicator against people, but it's mainly a prompt to say start doing it earlier. Okay. We'll leave modality as a selection the same.
Okay.
Yeah, it's mostly a reminder, because ultimately you can see that this will kind of work our way to our indicators, and we kind of know what we have on our indicators tends to be the workflow people follow, so that's why we're calling it out a bit earlier. Okay, so then this is the next bucket, the things that happen as we're now starting to do some of the testing. Maybe Olwen, shall I take this one and then you do the next one once we get into this is still kind of happening? Somewhat.
Yeah, no, I don't mind. I'll give you a break if you like. So I can do this one. So for the screen and testing, we put a lot of time and streamlining into this kind of section because this is the most difficult part for the KCC in getting testing organized back and able to submit the referral. Basically this is the flow of it. So the referral order is received, the screening of the patient, review the testing, consult requirements, then arranging the testing results. And then once everything is back, then the referral is submitted. So this has always been controversial because there's certain things in that we had before for requirement for referral that were essential before the referral goes through, and we've revised this, and this is probably in the next slide, Sharon, how we streamline this. So you can see here the testing criteria, we wanted to be more clear on it, and also certain elements of it were not necessarily mandatory in order to put the referral through. So we wanted all the process to be, first of all, standardized across all the, standardized across the centers, and also that the testing screening completed prior to the referral by the clinics and KC and in the KCC in the case of VGH and St. Paul's. Then we wanted a standardized requisition so that we could have all the requirements met, just rather than individual requisitions for the testing. And one of the big things, particularly in the provincial centres, is a long wait for certain tests. For example, MIBI tests or non-invasive cardiac testing. And that was something that we had to be conscious of as well in our mandatory requirements for registration. We wanted to minimize the tests that would be out of control for waiting time for the KCCs and the regional centres. Do you want to go to the next slide, Sharon? So the one-time requisition, this seems a lot, but it's actually, as you can see, it's not. It's just the standardized viral serology, the baseline blood work, blood type, so nothing really much has changed in this. We kept everything in that was there before. I don't think, Mike, we changed anything in that, as far as I know. So that hasn't changed, but we wanted a requisition that is easy for everybody in all the centres to use, rather than having to do a different type of requisition at each centre.
That's going to be the only difference, is we'll have one set standardized provincial.
Yeah. Do you want to go to the next? Okay. So there were certain test results that we want to have completed for the referral to be submitted. So from this, you can see the names of the tests and the conditions that the tests are required. So not everybody needs all of these tests. And I think there was a bit of confusion in that before, 20-year-old requiring a fit test, etc. So we have clarified here the indications for tests according to age, according to generalized cancer population screening, etc. So you can see they're all kind of outlined here, and bolded are the ones that we've kind of made clarifications on. You can see with the cardiac testing that one screening test was required. So either a stress echo, maybe or threadmill, or if they had an angiogram in the past, and not like if they had an angiogram, they still need a MIBI, etc. And then it's specifically for diabetics or patients greater than 50, or if they had cardiac symptoms or a history of cardiac disease. And I think a lot of confusion comes from that when people are trying to submit. Now, saying all of this, if a patient has a living donor, their GFR is falling, and these aren't done, there are workarounds in specific scenarios and exceptions as well, which we're working on to try and have as part of this process as well, so that people are not going to miss out on a chance of getting a preemptive transplant because they're waiting for a MIBI in an area that there's a long waiting time for a MIBI, etc. So the actual workaround in that will have to be through promise as well, because rather than having mandatory fields filled in order to have the registration submitted, we'll have to do a workaround with promise for this. And also there's a workaround as well by calling the transplant centers to let them know the scenario. I think there's a lot of questions and things on the chat, Sharon. Is there things that we need to address at the moment? Sorry, I can't get into the chat from here.
Like Mike.
I got Andrew just asked about the PSA, which I thought we had
We've taken off that, didn't we?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Because I know that was really controversial for a long time.
There you go. One last thing. And then maybe can I just mention something to preempt a question that comes up? So why we underlined here clarity around cardiac malignancy testing, it doesn't necessarily mean we've decreased this year, right? Like a thing we have to remember is these are still patients who are being investigated for transplant. I know we've got this question a lot from our KCC teams, is this is still a lot of cardiac tests, for example. The goal here, though, is by being crystal clear about who needs it and who doesn't. I still think we're ahead of the game rather than that guesswork, like Olin was saying, of people not knowing who they need to order a test for. And then with this clarity, everyone will just have to go back to their own local center and take into account what wait times are for various tests, and that'll inform when you order these things. You know, we're not able to fix if there's long wait time for maybe at some place, but by knowing that it's coming and starting this process early, the thought is that you should be able to have this done in advance of the patient moving forward. So I just want to mention that to preempt questions around there.
Yeah.
Sydney's got her hand up though.
Yeah, just one thing. So if we move the GFR up to 25, right, and we do a lot of these testing, I mean, they might be progressing, but if they're only progressing at 2 mils per minute, this is all going to be irrelevant testing, right? So I'm trying to see, is there something about the GFR of 25, but also like expected to start dialysis within 2 years or something? Because otherwise all this is going to be done again. A lot of patients end up getting screened for something, having a lot of procedures that wouldn't otherwise be necessary. So I'm just wondering if there's something about the time frame, because usually it takes, sorry, Owen, usually it takes quite a while to get everything done, but yeah, I'm just asking about that.
So the reason we said 25 was because we're trying to get the people that potentially could get done preemptively. So the 25 is the start of, education. So if we can get them at 25 for education, there's a chance that they might be able to find a living donor. And then the process can start with testing and all of that kind of thing. If they seem like they're able to outreach for donors. So that's why we're starting early, in order to get the education in and then give them time to see if there's potential donors. Certainly, I mean, if it's 25 and it's coming down very slowly and they're not getting donors, then the cardiac testing could be, can be held, unless there is an indication for it. But it's just, that's our thinking, to start at 25, or when it's falling at 25.
Yeah, and maybe we glossed over that point because we're so familiar with the workflows, but it's at this point, it's so they've had their education, decided they're going to go ahead with it, and then we're going to get the referral going. So yeah, we're assuming that that's kind of taking some time.
So it's not at 25 we start all this testing, Sunita. It's just to start the process at 25, because the education piece, which will be continuing all along, but if the education piece starts at 25, then they might be able to start outreaching for donors at that stage. And then if we identify that there is a chance there's donors, then we can maybe start testing and referral.
Yeah, and the other item I might mention is the only one that we're specifically doing here that needs to be really up to date is the echocardiogram. The rest is all just age-appropriate malignancy screening. And then for the invasive cardiac testing, it's basically if they've had one done, then the transplant team will decide if they need to do another one at the time of their assessment. So it's really just echo that we're talking about that would need to specifically be done. But it is a good point, Sydney, and I believe we do have this on our evaluation plan too, to be looking at this over time to basically see, are we doing a lot of duplicate investigations? Because that's the case, we will need to course correct later on. It's a really important point.
Thanks.
So the next part in this was the important part that Mike said that came up a lot with our patient advocates, and this was to track the individual patient where they're at along this journey, and because this has always been a void and has been a void for a long time, and it causes a lot of stress on the patients, on the nephrologists. and puts a lot of extra phone calls that we get here at the transplant center as well. This is something we're going to spend a lot of time on to try and rectify. We want to have the detailed patient level information with from one source of truth, and the source of truth will be PROMIS, and that's why we're working with the PROMIS team to work at those different stages that we showed a couple of slides ago, where there's points within PROMIS already that we will be able to show where the journey is at the moment. For example, registration accepted. Now for example, if the patient is registration accepted and they're waiting for an appointment to be seen at the transplant clinic, that we're hoping will be able to come in a tracking sheet that will be available on PROMIS in the nephrologist's office when the patient's there sitting in front of them. So they can tell exactly where the patient is. And also the tracking sheet will show what tests are still pending, if there are big ticket items that need to be done in order for them to move forward. So all of this information which should have been around for a long time and isn't, that really is very important for to be available in the nephrologist's office. And then hopefully the next step to that will be the patient will have the information. I think initially what's going to happen is that it will be available through PROMIS to the nephrologist and the kidney clinic or the provincial transplant clinic. But our hope in the future is that there's going to be some modality that the patient can check where they are in the process, whether that's through an app, which we've been talking for a long time with PROMIS, or some other way that they can track. But certainly from their KCC or nephrologist's office, hopefully that tracking sheet can be printed off and the patient can see where they are at in that snapshot of time. It should be accessible to all the patients in all the patient's team also, and that's why a single source of truth is necessary. At the moment, there's a lot of tracking sheets that have various components on Excel spreadsheets in different modalities right across the province, and there's no central application for that. And we just want everything to be in one source. And then that's important as well for the transplant clinic or for the transplant center to get any updates on how the workup is doing and where the tests are at and be time dated, etc. And then, of course, as Mike said before, we want to try and pre-populate any data that's coming in as much as possible for ease of the whole process. So this is the triage and access from the transplant center's point of view. So when we receive a referral, when it's submitted and received, then we have a triage system for how we see the patients in our clinic. And this is, well, first of all, the referral is accepted. So if the referral has all the components that we talked about done, then it's accepted and it goes through the process. And then, like before, we have red, yellow, and green. The red is not accepted. So what that means is that when we get the referral, we don't think that it should proceed to go through the process. If that's the case, we would advise the primary nephrologist who advises the patient, and oftentimes we would actually have an appointment with the patient to let them know why it's not possible for them to get transplanted, and that's often what we do now. In the yellow, there may be further testing that needs to be done in order for them to be ready to be seen at the clinic. That's not necessarily, that will be in addition to the workup that was done as part of the referral. And that's really just to make it easier for us to make a decision when we see them in pre-transplant assessment. If it's accepted, then the patient will be alerted the KCC and the regional transplant clinic alerted, and we are trying to put in place different types of alerts for this, which are standardized between the two transplant centers. Then we arrange for the assessment visit. The assessment happens, and oftentimes after that assessment, of course, there's additional testing, consults, etc., that are required. And then there's multidisciplinary activation rounds talking about their suitability. If they are not deemed suitable, then another alert will go to patient KCC and our regional transplant clinic, detailing that they're not suitable, why they're not suitable, etc. If they are suitable, then the same, another alert happens notifying all involved. Then depending on where their donor is at and where their GFR is at, the next step then would be booking or pre-op testing, etc. I think there was I just saw a few flashes of chat, but I can't read the actual questions. Sharon, can you see those?
Yeah. As we need to prioritize workload based on waiting time to transplant, will the tracking tool have language to capture this?
That's a really good question. If you don't mind, I'll pick that one up. So when we talk about those milestones, but these are all items that are both captured and promised. And the nice thing is because they're captured, everything's date stamped. So this is going to be one of the helpful things, is that we'll know where the gaps are, both on the individual patient level. You'll be able to see, oh, it's been 6 months and they're still stuck at this step. And in the aggregate, when we're looking at our metrics, we'll be able to see where people are getting caught in the process. But it's a really good point from an evaluation and a patient consideration standpoint that yes, we will definitely be able to capture time.
I mean, this is all the audit that we're going to be monitoring as well. We have taken a lot of time points here in order to an anticipation that there is backlogs in certain areas. And of course, there's a lot of confounding involved with this as well, because it may not be the recipient issue, it might be the donor issue that's held up, etc. So we're doing the same kind of process then for the donor, and seeing where the donor workflow, we're going to timestamp different time points as well to see where if there's a backlog in that process too. So all these will be going on in parallel.
Yeah, it's similar to like what we've done for vascular access, where we're trying to be more granular with it, because I think we have thoughts in our minds of where the delays are, but I think the reality is it's probably going to be different in different places. And the more granular we can be about these steps, the more we'll be able to find in each location what's the bottleneck and what's the snag. And can I just mention one more thing about the last screen here on Owen? Just that point we bolded. This is also going to be going on that one standard page in Promise, where if somebody's requested a specific test, it will be very clear on there what has been requested and who is doing it. So rather than just saying, oh, a patient needs to see a respirologist before they go, it'll say respirologist consult needed, Surrey Kidney Care will order this. And it'll be very granular, and everybody will be able to see what the steps are there. So everyone will know what's outstanding.
Okay. So I think we talked about this before, the communication part. So for patient updates, so targeted list of patients. We want, we're basically talking about those patients who have the GFR, less than 25. They will be specifically highlighted by KCC and to see where they're at in the process. And if it looks like that they're way behind and they're not look like they're going to be transplanted before their need to go on dialysis, then there will be a cut point whereby a decision will be made for preparation for dialysis. And similarly in the transplant centers, we will be looking at their GFR as well, and there will be a communication with KCC if we think that like there's no donor available, the donor won't be ready, etc., before they start dialysis.
Yeah, and so the pain point this is trying to replace is, both sides not getting as many updates, and the current workflow was basically saying, put an update about everybody in the wait list or everybody in the process and promise. Whereas what this is going to do is say, generate a specific list. And we're still finishing this in promise, but basically say, from the transplant side to Surrey Kidney Clinic, here is a list of 12 patients that that are coming up and we want an update about, and vice versa.
So it will basically eradicate that email we get on the first day of every month that we delete immediately, which says, tell us about your patients, any update this month, because that's not helpful. But if there are specific patients per center that there can be a communication on, that will be much easier for people to get back to the transplant center about, and vice versa.
There are a couple chats.
One of them was a list of patients be auto-populated. To some degree, that's the part we're working out. Like, so for the transplant side, actually, that should be easier to auto-populate. People who are coming up on their first assessment visit or what have you, some of it will be auto-populated, but some of it will need to be, it'll need to be reviewed by the team, and they might need to add some names to it manually. It's basically, rather than all of these, so a lot of the time is being sent with phone calls back and forth, and that's still going to have to happen. Don't get me wrong, communication between one-on-one providers is absolutely necessary and still going to need to happen, but it's almost like having a set time to say, this month, here's the people we know we need an update on, and we'll try to make it as easy as possible. Some of it is what we foresee is going to be a yes, no, right? Has anything changed? No. No, you just tick off, nothing's changed for these people. And then at least somebody has actively made that communication for a set list of patients.
And I think the most important not really communication, but the access is that tracking sheet, because that will tell everybody from both sides, like where the patient is at and where they're stuck and what they're waiting for and what needs to be done to move them forward. And that will be very individualized to the patient.
There was one more chat in here around, I think, having explicit conversations with patients about rough wait times based on blood group and dialysis start dates are helpful. Of course, there are specific patient factors. It can provide a general explanation how we triage, prioritize workload to patients as well as home teams.
Yeah, so that's not been a big conversation with us, because we're trying to get people living donors and trying to get them transplanted before they go on dialysis or before they're actually eligible for the wait list. But certainly, you're very correct. I mean, it's changing all the time, the waiting times and for various blood groups. And that's probably not going to be available on promise, but that's something that maybe on a quarterly basis, we could get the stats for the last quarter about waiting times for various blood types. But again, it depends on the individual patients and their sensitization as well. So it may not be generalizable to your particular patient, and it sometimes can give them a false sense of things will happen quickly, and it might not in their situation.
But just a reminder that right now we're focusing on living preemptive transplant. I think as we build these milestones in, though, a lot of these learnings are going to be directly translatable to help us, shore up our deceased donor transplant process as well.
So we mentioned some of these before, resources to help the workflow. So the referral form we talked about, There's a transplant and living donor resource information sheet that we kind of put together from all the different links, which include links to websites with various information, including, for patients, for KCC, for nephrologists, for GPs, about the process of living donation, the process of kidney transplant, and also how to approach, how to outreach for living donors. So that's very valuable, and that will be updated because there's new links coming out all the time. We also wanted to get the family doctor involved in all of this as well, and to provide them with an information sheet, because oftentimes the potential recipient will ask them about donation, and there's some misinformation out there about donors, etc. too. So I think it's important to get them involved early in the whole process too. Information sheet for patients, and for the kidney teams as well, like worksheets and this tracking sheet and etc. So we want to try and standardize them so that and this will be helpful in the continuous education from different sources along the pathway, if the information is consistent.
The one other one I might add is just this implementation worksheet. So this is one of the other key items here. So when we think back to that list of milestones, what we mean by implementation worksheet is, like a lot of other things in kidney care, we're not dictating exactly who must do every role. Like, we're not going to say this must be an RN or this must be a social worker, what have you. But what we are going to do is every clinic will go through the process of saying, for each of these items, we have identified that this person has ownership and responsibility for it. And I think it's a key part of this process, is since we want to make sure that every step is happening, we're going to have accountability as to who is doing this in every location. So we're not going to dictate who is doing it, but we will dictate and will monitor that everybody has identified whose role this is.
So a lot of work done and a lot of work to do. Mike mentioned briefly we're trying to develop options to get living donor outreach support process in place, streamline the donor identification assessment process, of course. We have a lot of work to do with the Promise team. We have our dream promise, and we just want to make sure that it's actually able to happen, and to try and use as much as we can what's there at the moment in order to make it easier to implement. Then we have to do an evaluation plan, and establish an implementation working group as well. There'll be a lot of review of the process and review of the timing, as we talked about before, to see where are the areas that require more work and require more streamlined processing to help the workflow. So I hope that kind of gives a clearer picture of where we're at the moment, and happy to take any questions in addition to what you've asked before.
And if you think of something after this meeting, I just want to put a pitch out there, feel free to send it to Sharon. We're purposely doing this before we start with implementation to make sure we've got, any feedback or any thoughts we may have missed, right? So we definitely welcome the input. Now is the time to do it.
We also have another session on July 16th that you can come to again.
And as we mentioned before, we have several patient advocates. One of them here today, Bill Deere, who've been really helpful in this whole process and given us a whole new perspective on what it's like from the patient perspective. So we've tried to incorporate a lot of a lot of their ideas into this whole process as well. So thanks, Bill.
Hi, this is Marie from Interior. I just think this sounds fantastic, and I really like actually that the nurses are able to identify patients and start the education process early, because the nephrologists are often focused on something else. So I think that's excellent, and I think it would be great if the patients are able to find out where they're at in the process too, and incorporating the family doctors more in this. I think there's some really outstanding aspects to this, so thank you.
Oh, thanks, Maria. And I want to even call out further to our patient partners, that whole item about us being able to share exactly the same update of where they're at that we do with the team, and also share with the patient partners. That came from them. That came from the patient partners. This wasn't actually on our work plan initially, and it just shows how valuable that input is. And it went from being something that wasn't on our work plan to something that's non-negotiable and absolutely needs to be done. So I think that's going to be a huge improvement. And Bill, I see you were going to say something here, or you unmuted yourself. Did you want to comment on that?
You know, the whole process, and part of this today is a little eye-opening for me, because I wasn't aware of all the steps that we were going through. But it certainly will help, particularly when patients are going through the process and trying to, you know, they're getting information back about their donors, but their donors don't know where they're at. And this is going to help a lot of that, so that everybody can identify where they're at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's just critical.
It's Andrea. So I think the other piece, though, when we're talking about patients that have potential donors, and we're trying to be cognizant of a recipient's declining GFR, and we're trying to figure out if they need to start dialysis or not, because the donor assessment is confidential and we cannot provide information about the donor to the recipient. We have to be careful what language we're using in these tools to communicate, so that we're not divulging information we're not supposed to share.
That's really important.
Yeah, that's really a good point, Andrea. And we've been very cognizant of that when we're doing like tracking sheet, etc. We've given the minimal information. You know, because we have to protect the confidentiality of the donor. So that's something that, you know, we have to be careful of, because this information will be available to anybody who can access Promise. So some of that information will still be just phone calls, etc., as well, between the transplant team and the nephrologist about exactly where they're at. We're not going to be able to avoid those kind of communications.
Yeah, I think even if there's because of you know, rotating staff, things like that, if we could even have options of standardized language to use in circumstances like that, so that it protects everybody from misstepping, perhaps, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, yeah, that's what we're doing actually, Andrea. So you'll see that probably in the workshop that's coming up, in with what we've done about the tracking sheet.
Yeah, and the one step that's probably relevant is that point where we're saying we want an update. And I think we're still figuring out exactly how to operationalize this, but the language we've kind of settled on is basically the KCC asking the question of not, is this donor ready, but this patient is progressing to the point where we need to make a decision about dialysis. Do you realistically see preemptive transplant happening, or do we get ready for dialysis? Basically that yes or no question. And it's not going to be something that lives in Promise, but rather it's going to be, our goal is to facilitate that communication, this generation of patient lists back and forward. But that's the type of question that we're going to ask, rather than is donor X ready to go. And then that way that the team can kind of, because this is what we're doing right now in one-off phone calls, right? Of saying, do you really think it's going to happen, or do we need to get a fistula in this person, or do we need to get a PD tube in this person? So that's kind of the level we're going at. But we're very, very aware that it's not like we're going to give everybody access to where a certain donor is or anything like that.
Mike, just to comment on that, this is Bill again. You know, right up until the 2 days before my transplant, I was still getting a call from a nephrologist suggesting that I go in and be prepared for dialysis when I was packing my suitcase to go to the coast for transplant. So, you know, that was a little upsetting as a patient, because then you wonder, you know, is the communication not there between the actual transplant center and the KCC, for instance?
Completely agree. That's why this is such a goal here. All the teams need to know where each other is at. Great. Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, if anything you think of later on, again, please do email them in. We want to hear it all. You know, this is the time to get it in.
It's Andrea. I just real quick for just to comment on what Bill said. I think it's also a great idea for us to educate patients that while they're waiting for their transplant, they'll continue to be monitored by their home teams, so that they know that it's not one or the other. It's still going to be a bit of both, but just to decrease confusion about who's doing what. So thank you, Bill, for your comments. It's helpful.
Anything now, we're kind of at the top of the hour. I would just want to thank everyone for the feedback so far. This is some great comments here. And please do, I can't say it enough, send in anything. If you think of anything later today or what have you, just email it over to Sharon. Guys, thanks again.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.